"I have 30 days left to live," was what the homeless man said to the millionaire, leaving everyone in shock. Jack Thompson walked with confident strides through Central Park, surrounded by a retinue of bodyguards who kept curious onlookers at bay. His impeccable three-piece suit and aristocratic bearing contrasted sharply with the green, carefree surroundings of the park in full spring bloom. At 50 years old, Jack was the very image of success. Owner of a vast financial empire, his name was synonymous with power and wealth throughout the country. As he advanced along the main path, his mind was occupied reviewing the details of the next merger he would carry out. Millions of dollars were at stake, and as always, Jack planned to emerge victorious. His concentration was such that he barely noticed the bustle around him: children playing, couples strolling, street vendors hawking their wares. Suddenly, a haggard figure stepped into his path. The bodyguards reacted instantly, forming a human wall between Jack and the intruder. But something in the man's gaze made Jack raise his hand, stopping his security team. "Let him through," he ordered firmly. The man, a homeless person of indeterminate age, approached with a limp. His clothes were ragged and dirty, but his eyes shone with a disconcerting intensity. He planted himself in front of Jack, completely ignoring the bodyguards flanking him. Ready to act at the slightest sign of threat, "Jack Thompson," the homeless man pronounced in a surprisingly clear and powerful voice. "The man who has everything and has nothing." Jack arched an eyebrow, more intrigued than offended. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to get his attention in an extravagant way. But there was something about this man that prevented him from simply ignoring him and continuing on his way. "Do we know each other?" Jack asked, maintaining his cold and controlled tone. The homeless man let out a laugh that resonated in the air, attracting the attention of nearby passers-by. "I know you, Jack Thompson, better than you know yourself, and I've come to give you a message." The bodyguards tensed, but Jack held them back again with a gesture. His curiosity was piqued. "And what is that message?" he inquired, allowing himself a condescending smile. The homeless man took a step forward, coming so close that Jack could smell the scent of earth and sweat emanating from him. His eyes, a deep and unsettling blue, bore into Jack's. "You have 30 days left to live," the homeless man pronounced in a voice that seemed to resonate in the air itself. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine, but he recovered quickly. He let out a forced laugh and shook his head. Well, is that all 30 days? I guess I'll have to hurry up and spend all my fortune, won't I?" he responded sarcastically. The homeless man was not fazed by the mockery. Instead, his gaze became even more intense. "Laugh now, Jack Thompson, but remember my words when your empire begins to crumble, when your allies turn their backs on you, when your body betrays you. 30 days, not one more, not one less." Before Jack could respond, the homeless man turned and limped away, disappearing into the park crowd. The bodyguards made as if to follow him, but Jack stopped them. "Let him go," he ordered, regaining his composure. "He's nothing but a madman." The group resumed their walk, but Jack couldn't help casting one last glance behind him, searching for the mysterious homeless man among the people. He didn't see him anywhere. That night in the luxurious Thompson mansion, Jack found himself in his private study, a glass of whiskey in hand, and his gaze lost in the city skyline that stretched beyond the windows. His wife Elizabeth entered the room, as elegant as ever, in a black cocktail dress. "Aren't you coming to dinner, darling?" she asked, her voice sweet but with a hint of impatience. "The Wilsons are waiting." Jack turned to her, noticing for the first time in a long time how beautiful his wife was. When had he stopped appreciating these details? "Yes, of course," he replied, setting the glass on the desk. "I was just thinking—" Elizabeth approached, her expensive perfume filling the space between them. "About what? Any problem with the merger?" Jack shook his head. "No, nothing like that. It's just that—" He paused, unsure whether to share the strange encounter in the park. Finally, he decided. It was foolish to give it importance. "It's nothing, come on, let's not keep our guests waiting." As they left the study, Jack couldn't help feeling a twinge of unease. The homeless man's words kept echoing in his mind. "You have 30 days left to live." He shook his head, trying to rid himself of those thoughts. It was ridiculous. Of course he was Jack Thompson, one of the most powerful men in the country. Nothing could touch him. However, as he headed to the dining room, where laughter and conversation already floated in the air, a feeling of unease settled in his stomach. For the first time in years, Jack Thompson felt that he didn't have absolute control over his destiny. Dinner proceeded with the usual mix of light chat and veiled negotiations. Jack played his part to perfection, as always, but part of his mind kept turning over the encounter in the park. When the guests finally left and the house fell silent, he retired to his bedroom, hoping a good night's sleep would erase those absurd thoughts from his mind. But sleep did not come easily that night. Jack tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep. Beside him, Elizabeth slept peacefully, oblivious to the storm raging in her husband's mind. As the hours passed and darkness gave way to the first rays of dawn, Jack finally fell into a restless sleep, plagued by nightmares where a giant clock counted down from 30. The next morning, Jack woke up with renewed determination. He dressed in his best suit, determined to prove that the words of a crazy homeless man had no power over him. However, as he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, he couldn't help but notice that his hands were shaking slightly. "Nonsense," he muttered to himself. "I'm Jack Thompson. Nothing can stop me." With that affirmation, he left his room ready to face a new day at the helm of his empire. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered, "You have 29 days left." The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Jack Thompson entered the central offices of his financial conglomerate. The building, a glass and steel skyscraper that dominated the city skyline, was a monument to his success. Early rising employees bowed their heads as he passed, a mixture of respect and fear in their eyes. Jack headed straight for the boardroom on the top floor. Today was the day he would finally close the merger with Wilson Industries, a deal he had been negotiating for months, and that would further consolidate his position in the market. As he entered the room, he found his legal and financial team already gathered, going over the final details of the contract. His personal assistant, Lucy, approached with a cup of black coffee, strong and without sugar, just as he liked it. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Lucy greeted. "Mr. Wilson and his team will arrive in 20 minutes. Jack nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Perfect. Any last-minute developments?" Lucy hesitated for a second, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Jack. "Well, sir, there have been some rumors in the market." "What kind of rumors?" Jack interrupted, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Nothing concrete, sir," Lucy hurried to clarify. "Just speculations about the financial solidity of Wilson Industries. It's probably nothing." Jack frowned. He didn't like surprises, especially not on such a crucial day as this. "Investigate further. I want to know everything before I sign." The next few minutes passed in tense silence. As the team reviewed the documents one last time, Jack found himself looking at his watch repeatedly, an unusual habit for him. Was it his imagination, or did time seem to be moving more slowly? Finally, the doors opened, and George Wilson entered. Accompanied by his entourage of lawyers and advisors, Jack stood up to greet him. Immediately noticing that something wasn't right, Wilson's smile seemed forced, and there was a tension in the air that didn't bode well. "Jack, old friend," Wilson greeted, shaking his hand. "Before we begin, there's something we need to discuss in private." Jack felt a knot in his stomach, but kept his expression impassive. "Of course, George. Let's use my office." Once alone, Wilson got straight to the point. "I'm sorry, Jack, but I can't go ahead with the merger." The words fell like a thunderbolt. Jack was momentarily speechless, something that hadn't happened to him in years. "What are you saying, George? We've been working on this for months. The contracts are ready to be signed." Wilson ran a hand over his face, looking genuinely sorry. I know, but complications have arisen. Some of our main investors have backed out at the last moment. Without their support, I can't risk this merger." Jack felt anger growing inside him. "This is unacceptable, George. We have an agreement." "A non-binding agreement," Wilson replied. "I'm sorry, Jack, really, but my decision is final." As he watched Wilson and his team leave the building, Jack felt stunned. Never before had he experienced a setback of this magnitude. And the worst part was that he couldn't get the homeless man's words out of his head. When your empire begins to crumble, the rest of the day passed in a blur of crisis meetings and frantic phone calls. News of the failed merger spread like wildfire through financial circles. By the time Jack arrived home, that night, the value of his company's stocks had fallen by 15%. Elizabeth was waiting for him in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand and a worried expression on her face. "I've seen the news," she said simply. Jack poured himself a double whiskey, desperately needing something strong. "It's just a setback," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We'll overcome it." Elizabeth approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Of course we will, darling. We always do." That night Jack couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, mentally reviewing every detail of the negotiations, looking for the moment when everything had gone wrong. How had he not seen it coming? Was he losing his touch? The next morning, things only got worse. Several important contracts were cancelled, citing market uncertainty. Rumors about financial problems in the Thompson empire multiplied. Despite the efforts of the public relations team to contain them, Jack locked himself in his office, working frantically to keep his empire afloat. But for the first time in his career, he felt like he was losing control. Calls from concerned partners followed one after another, and it became increasingly difficult for him to project the image of confidence and control that had always been his hallmark. By mid-afternoon, when he thought things couldn't get worse, he received a call from his personal doctor. The results of his latest tests had arrived, and there were some anomalies that required immediate attention. "It's probably nothing serious," the doctor assured him, "but given your family history and the level of stress you're under, I'd like you to come in for more thorough examinations." Jack hung up the phone, feeling the world closing in around him. The homeless man's words resonated in his mind with terrifying clarity. "When your body betrays you." That night, sitting alone in his study, Jack Thompson contemplated the city through the windows. The flickering lights of the buildings and nighttime traffic seemed to mock him, reminding him that the world kept turning while his own universe threatened to crumble. With a glass of whiskey in hand, Jack mentally reviewed the events of the past few days. The failed merger with Wilson Industries, the cancelled contracts, the market rumors, and now the call from his doctor. Everything seemed to be conspiring against him, as if the universe itself had decided to test his legendary control. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said. Without taking his gaze from the window, Elizabeth entered, wrapped in a silk robe. Her face, normally serene and calculating, showed signs of concern. "Jack, it's late. Aren't you coming to bed?" He turned to look at her, noticing for the first time in a long time the small wrinkles around her eyes, the grey hairs that were beginning to show at her temples. When had they aged so much? "In a moment," he replied, his voice hoarser than he expected. "I'm just thinking." Elizabeth approached, standing beside him in front of the window. "Is it about the merger?" "Jack, you've faced challenges before. You always come out on top." Jack let out a bitter laugh. "What if this time is different, Elizabeth? What if—" He stopped, hesitating whether to share his deepest concerns. "If what?" she pressed, her hand gently resting on his arm. Jack took a deep breath. "Do you remember the homeless man in the park? The one who stopped me a few days ago?" Elizabeth frowned. "Vaguely." "What about him?" "He told me something I can't get out of my head." Jack turned to look her directly in the eyes. "He said I had 30 days left to live." Elizabeth blinked, surprised, before letting out a nervous laugh. "Jack, please, don't tell me you're taking the words of a crazy street person seriously." I know," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "It sounds ridiculous, but since that day, everything has started to fall apart. The merger, the contracts, and now my health." Elizabeth's expression changed from disbelief to concern. "Your health? Jack, what's going on?" He sighed, sinking into a nearby armchair. "The doctor called today. He wants to do more tests. Says he found some anomalies in my latest results. Elizabeth knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "Darling, listen to me. You can't let this affect you like this. You're Jack Thompson. You've built an empire from scratch. You're not going to let a couple of setbacks and the words of a vagrant bring you down, are you?" Jack looked at her, seeking in her eyes the strength he had always admired in her. "You're right," he said finally. "I can't allow myself this moment of weakness tomorrow. I'll start fixing all of this." Elizabeth smiled, but Jack couldn't help noticing a flash of something else in her eyes. Worry? Or something deeper, more calculating? "That's more like it," she said, standing up and extending her hand. "Now let's go to bed. Tomorrow will be a new day." As he followed Elizabeth out of the study, Jack couldn't help feeling that something had changed between them. The connection they had once shared, based on mutual ambition and an insatiable desire for power, seemed to have transformed into something more fragile, more volatile. The next morning, Jack woke up before dawn, determined to regain control of his life and his empire. He dressed in his best suit, arming himself with the confidence that had always been his best weapon. At the office, he called an emergency meeting with his executive team. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice booming in the boardroom, "we have suffered some setbacks, it's true, but this is not the end. It's an opportunity to demonstrate why we are the best at what we do." Over the next few hours, Jack outlined an aggressive plan to regain market confidence, new investment strategies, debt, restructuring, and even the possibility of expanding into new sectors. His team listened with a mixture of admiration and fear, recognizing the man who had built a financial empire from scratch. However, as the day progressed, Jack began to notice something disturbing. Whispers in the hallways that died down when he approached, furtive glances between his executives, and most worryingly, calls and meetings that seemed to be taking place without his knowledge. It was Lucy, his loyal assistant, who finally gave him the news. "Mr. Thompson," she said, entering his office with a worried expression, "I think you should know something. There are rumors that some board members are considering asking for your resignation." The news hit Jack like a punch to the stomach. "My resignation? On what grounds?" Lucy looked uncomfortable. "They're concerned about the recent losses, sir. And there are rumors about your health. Some think you're no longer fit to lead the company." Jack felt anger growing inside him. "Who are they? Tell me their names, Lucy. I want to know who's behind this." But before Lucy could answer, the office door burst open. It was Robert Beggar, one of the oldest members of the board of directors, and until that moment, one of Jack's closest allies. "Jack," Robert said, his voice cold and professional, "we need to talk. The board has met, and we've made a decision." Jack stood up, confronting Robert with all the authority he could muster. "A decision? Without consulting me? I am the president of this company. Robert, nothing is decided without my approval." Robert didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, Jack, but things have changed. The board considers that, given the current circumstances, it's best for the company if you step aside. Temporarily, of course." Jack felt the ground moving beneath his feet. His empire, his life's work, was being snatched from his hands. And the worst part was that he couldn't help thinking of the homeless man's words, "When your allies turn their backs on you." As Robert continued talking about transitions and press releases, Jack found himself looking out the window of his office, toward the city he once believed he held in the palm of his hand. The sun was setting, tinging the sky a blood red that seemed to mock his fall. At that moment, Jack Thompson, the man who had had it all, realized he was losing much more than his company. He was losing his identity, his purpose, and perhaps, if the homeless man was right, even his life. With a sigh of defeat, Jack turned to Robert. "Very well," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll make the announcement tomorrow." As Robert left the office, visibly relieved, Jack sank into his chair. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to do something he hadn't done since he was a child. He cried outside. The city continued its frantic rhythm, oblivious to the drama unfolding high up in Thompson Tower. And somewhere, an invisible clock continued its countdown, marking the passage of the days. Jack Thompson had left. The news of Jack Thompson's temporary leave spread like wildfire through the city's financial and social circles. Newspaper headlines speculated about the reasons behind this sudden decision, while in the corridors of power, conspiracy theories and apocalyptic predictions about the future of the Thompson Empire were whispered. Jack, for his part, found himself in a state of shock. After making the official announcement, he had retreated to his mansion, refusing to receive calls or visits. Elizabeth, surprisingly, had been his only constant support during those first tumultuous days. "You need to rest, darling," she would tell him, as she served him tea on their bedroom terrace. "This is only temporary. You'll soon be back stronger than ever." But Jack barely listened to her. His mind was occupied going over every decision, every move that had led him to this point. How had he allowed things to go so far? At what point had he lost control? It was on the afternoon of the third day when Jack finally decided to emerge from his self-imposed isolation. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to look for them. "I'm going out," he announced to Elizabeth, who looked at him with surprise. "Are you sure? The journalists are still camped in front of the house." Jack nodded with determination. "It's time to face reality I can't hide forever." Disguised with a cap and sunglasses, Jack managed to elude the reporters and headed to the park, where he had had that fateful encounter with the homeless man. For hours he walked every path, every corner, searching for the man who had predicted his downfall. As the sun began to set, exhausted and frustrated, Jack was about to give up. It was then that he saw him, sitting on a secluded bench wearing the same ragged clothes, and with the penetrating gaze he remembered. "I was waiting for you," said the homeless man when Jack approached. "I knew you would come seeking answers." Jack dropped onto the bench beside him, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Who are you really? How did you know what was going to happen?" The homeless man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm no one special, Jack Thompson. Just someone who has seen this game played many times before." "Game? What are you talking about?" "The game of power, of course," replied the homeless man, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "You think you're the first to build an empire, to feel invincible, to think you have absolute control, but you're nothing more than a piece on a much larger board." Jack felt anger growing inside him. "I didn't come here to listen to riddles, I want the truth. How did you know what was going to happen?" The homeless man looked him directly in the eyes, and Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "The truth, Jack Thompson, is that your fall was orchestrated long before our encounter. I was just the messenger." "Orchestrated by whom?" "By those closest to you," replied the homeless man. "Those you blindly trust. Your empire isn't being attacked from the outside, Jack. It's being devoured from within." Jack felt the world stop. Images of the past weeks flashed through his mind. The furtive glances of his executives, Elizabeth's insistence that he rest and stay away from the office, the speed with which the board had taken control. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "It can't be." "Open your eyes, Jack Thompson," insisted the homeless man. "Time is running out. If you want to save what's left of your life and your legacy, you must act now." With those words, the homeless man stood up and began to walk away. Jack, still stunned by the revelation, called out to him, "Wait, what should I do?" The homeless man stopped and turned to look at him one last time. "Trust your instinct. And remember, true power isn't in money or position, it's in the truth." With that, he disappeared into the park crowd, leaving Jack alone with his turbulent thoughts. That night, back in his mansion, Jack locked himself in his study, determined to uncover the truth behind his fall. Hours passed as he reviewed documents, made discreet calls, and connected dots he had previously overlooked. It was near dawn when all the pieces fell into place. With trembling hands, Jack held a set of documents that proved a conspiracy that went beyond his worst fears. Not only had his board of directors been working in secret to oust him, but Elizabeth, his own wife, had been one of the main architects of the plan. The documents revealed a complex network of fund transfers, secret contracts, and under-the-table agreements. Elizabeth, along with Robert Beggar and other key board members, had been preparing the ground for this takeover for months, perhaps years. Jack felt sick. Every moment of support, every word of encouragement from Elizabeth in recent days, It had all been an act. While he struggled to maintain control, she was already positioning herself to take the reins of his empire. With a heavy heart but a clear mind for the first time in weeks, Jack faced a crossroads. The documents he had before him were a time bomb, capable of destroying not only Elizabeth and the conspirators, but potentially the entire empire he had built with so much effort. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon when Jack finally made a decision. He wasn't going to fall without a fight, but he also wasn't going to let himself be carried away by blind vengeance. He needed to be smart, more calculating than he had ever been. With deliberate movements, he stored the documents in his safe and headed for the shower. As the hot water fell on him, Jack planned his next move. He needed allies, but who could he trust now? As he came out of the bathroom, he found Elizabeth waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a smile that now seemed more like a grimace to Jack's eyes. "Good morning, darling," she said, offering him the cup. "You got up early. Is everything okay?" Jack took the cup, keeping his face neutral. "Yes, everything's fine. I just had some things to think about." Elizabeth looked at him with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Jack, I know these days have been difficult, but remember that I'm here for you. Together we'll get through this." For a moment, Jack felt the temptation to confront her, right there, to throw all the truth he had discovered in her face, but he held back. The time for confrontations would come, but not yet. "I know, dear," he replied, forcing a smile. "In fact, I was thinking of going back to the office today. I think I've rested enough." Elizabeth seemed momentarily surprised, but quickly regained her composure. "Are you sure the board agreed that you would take some time?" "The board is not my boss, Elizabeth," Jack interrupted, a touch of his old authority in his voice. "It's time for me to get back to work." Without waiting for a response, Jack headed to his closet to get dressed. He could feel Elizabeth's eyes on him, calculating, readjusting her plans. An hour later, Jack entered the Thompson Enterprises building, ignoring the surprised looks from employees. He headed straight for his office, where he found Lucy, his assistant, visibly nervous. "Mr. Thompson, we weren't expecting to see you today," she said, hurriedly standing up from her desk. Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Lucy, I just came to catch up on some things. Could you get me the financial reports from the last 3 months?" As Lucy hurried to fulfill his request, Jack locked himself in his office. He needed to move fast. He knew that the moment Robert Beggar and the others found out about his presence, they would try to block him again. For the next few hours, Jack worked frenetically, reviewing reports, making discreet calls to trusted contacts outside the company, and plotting a plan to regain control. It was near noon when the door to his office burst open. Robert Beggar entered, his face a mask of false concern. "Jack, what are you doing here? I thought we had agreed that you would take some time to rest," Robert said, his condescending tone barely hiding his irritation. Jack looked at him steadily, allowing a hint of his knowledge to reflect in his eyes. "Robert, old friend, did you really think I would stay at home while my company was being restructured?" Robert seemed momentarily disconcerted by Jack's tone, but quickly regained his composure. "Jack, I understand this is difficult for you, but you must trust that we're doing what's best for the company." Jack slowly stood up, resting his hands on the desk. "What's best for the company, or what's best for you and the other conspirators?" The color drained from Robert's face. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "Oh, I think you know very well," Jack replied, his voice dangerously soft. "But don't worry, Robert, soon everyone will know exactly what I'm talking about." Before Robert could respond, Jack walked around him and headed for the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important meeting." Leaving a stunned Robert in his office, Jack headed for the elevator. His next move required a bold play, and he knew exactly who he needed to see. Half an hour later, Jack found himself in a discreet cafe in the city center, facing Daniel Guzman, the state attorney general and an old acquaintance. "Jack, I must admit your call surprised me," Daniel said, studying his interlocutor's face. "Rumors about your situation have been circulating everywhere." Jack smiled humorlessly. "I'm sure they have, but Daniel, what I'm about to tell you goes far beyond simple corporate rumors." Over the next hour, Jack laid out the entire conspiracy to Daniel, backing up each accusation with the documents he had gathered. Daniel listened in silence, his expression becoming increasingly grave. "This is explosive, Jack," Daniel finally said. "If what you're saying is true, we're talking about large-scale corporate fraud, market manipulation, possibly even money laundering." Jack nodded gravely. "I know, and I'm willing to cooperate fully with any investigation. But I need your help, Daniel. I can't allow these traitors to get away with it." Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering his options. "You know this could destroy your company, right? Once we start this investigation, there's no turning back." Jack looked out the cafe window, observing the bustle of the city that had been his kingdom. "I know," he said softly, "but I'd rather see my empire fall with the truth than see it prosper on lies and betrayals." Daniel nodded. "Slowly, very well, Jack. I'll start mobilizing my team discreetly, but I need you to stay calm and act normally. We can't alert the suspects." As they said goodbye, Jack felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had set in motion a plan that could destroy everything he had built, but he also felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in years, he was acting not out of ambition or greed, but out of a sense of justice. Back at his mansion that night, Jack found himself face to face with Elizabeth. She was waiting for him in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand and an indecipherable expression on her face. "You had a busy day," she commented casually. Jack looked at her, searching her face for some sign of the woman he had once loved. "Yes, quite busy," he replied, pouring himself a whiskey. Elizabeth approached, placing a hand on his arm. "Jack, what are you doing? You know the board only wants what's best for the company. For us." For a moment, Jack considered confronting her, revealing that he knew everything, but the memory of the homeless man's words stopped him. True power is in the truth, and the truth, he decided, would be revealed in due time. "I know, dear," he finally said, covering Elizabeth's hand with his own. "I'm just trying to protect what we've built together." As Elizabeth smiled, apparently relieved, Jack couldn't help but think about how they had gotten to this point. At what moment had their marriage, his company, his entire life become an elaborate farce? That night, lying in bed next to the woman he now knew had betrayed him, Jack found himself counting the days. According to the homeless man's prophecy, he had little more than 3 weeks left to live. But instead of fearing that deadline, Jack now saw it as a challenge. He had 3 weeks to unmask the truth, to redeem himself, to leave a legacy that was more than just wealth and power. With that determination in mind, Jack finally fell asleep, his mind already planning the next day's moves in this dangerous chess game his life had become. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Jack. On the outside, he maintained the facade of a man slowly retaking the reins of his company. He attended meetings, reviewed reports, and appeared cooperative with the board of directors. But inside, his mind worked incessantly, connecting dots, uncovering new layers of the conspiracy that had threatened to destroy him. Each night, upon returning home, he would find Elizabeth, who greeted him with a smile that now seemed like a mask. They shared silent dinners, exchanging superficial comments about the day, while both concealed their true thoughts and plans. It was during one of these dinners, approximately a week after his encounter with Daniel Guzman, when Jack felt something change within him. As he watched Elizabeth talk about a charity gala they were planning to attend, he realized that he no longer felt the anger or resentment that had driven him in the previous days. In their place was a deep sadness and, surprisingly, compassion. "Elizabeth," he interrupted softly, "are you happy?" The question seemed to take Elizabeth by surprise. For a moment, her mask of perfection cracked, and Jack glimpsed the woman he had married so many years ago. "What kind of question is that, Jack?" she responded, trying to keep her tone light. "Of course I'm happy we have everything we could desire." Jack looked at her intently, really seeing her for the first time in years. "Do we? Sometimes I wonder if in our quest to have it all we haven't lost the most important thing." Elizabeth set down her wineglass, her hand trembling slightly. "Jack, what are you talking about? You've been acting strange lately. Is it because of the company? Because I already told you that everything will be solved." "It's not just about the company, Elizabeth," Jack interrupted, his voice tired but firm. "It's about us, about who we've become. When was the last time we did something just because it made us happy, without thinking about how it would affect our image or our empire?" Elizabeth looked at him, a mixture of confusion and something that could be fear in her eyes. "Jack, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Jack stood up from the table, walking to the window. The city shone in the night, a constant reminder of the world he had built, of the power he had accumulated. But now, everything seemed empty. "You know, I've been thinking a lot lately," he said without turning around, "about life, about what really matters. And I've realized that I've spent so much time building this empire that I forgot to build a life." He turned to look at Elizabeth, who was watching him with an indecipherable expression. "Tomorrow I'm going to make some changes in the company, important changes, and I want you to know that whatever happens, I don't hold any grudge against you." Elizabeth stood up abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "Jack, I don't understand anything you're saying. What changes? Why would you talk to me about grudges?" Jack approached her, taking her hands in his. For a moment, he saw a glimpse of the woman he had fallen in love with so many years ago. "Elizabeth, I know everything that's been going on about the conspiracy, about your role in it, and I want you to know that I forgive you." The color drained from Elizabeth's face. She tried to withdraw her hands, but Jack held them firmly. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "It's okay," Jack said softly. "It doesn't matter anymore. Tomorrow, everything will come to light, but I wanted you to know that despite everything, I still remember the woman you were, the woman I fell in love with, and I hope that somehow she's still in there." With that, Jack released her hands and left the dining room, leaving a stunned and trembling Elizabeth behind. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He stayed in his study, going over the events of the past few weeks, preparing for what would come the next day. But for the first time since it all began, he didn't feel anxiety or fear. Instead, there was a strange sense of peace. The next morning, Jack woke up before dawn. He dressed, carefully choosing his best suit. Today was not a day for armor, but for naked truth. When he arrived at the offices of Thompson Enterprises, the building was practically empty. Only Lucy, his faithful assistant, was waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a look of concern. "Mr. Thompson, are you sure you want to do this?" she asked as she followed him to his office. Jack smiled warmly at her. "More sure than ever, Lucy. Thank you for your loyalty all these years." As the sun rose over the city, executives and board members began to arrive for the emergency meeting Jack had called. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. As everyone took their seats, exchanging confused and worried glances, Robert Beggar was the last to enter, his face a mask of false concern. "Jack, what is all this? I thought we had agreed that you would take time to rest." Jack stood up, his presence filling the room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know you have many questions, and I assure you that they will all be answered today." With a gesture, he indicated for Lucy to close the doors of the room. Then, with deliberate movements, he began to distribute folders to each of those present. "What you have in front of you," Jack continued, his voice firm and clear, "is detailed evidence of a conspiracy to take control of Thompson Enterprises, a conspiracy in which several of those present in this room have actively participated." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert Beggar was the first to regain his voice. "What the hell is this, Jack? Are you accusing us of something?" Jack looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm not accusing, Robert. I'm exposing the truth. Every document in those folders has been verified and authenticated. Fund transfers, secret contracts, covert communications, it's all there." Chaos erupted in the room. Some executives began shouting accusations, others vehemently denying their involvement. Jack remained calm in the midst of the storm, watching as years of lies and betrayals crumbled before his eyes. It was then that the doors of the room burst open. Daniel Guzman entered, followed by a team of federal agents. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel announced, his voice cutting through the chaos, I am Attorney General Daniel Guzman. You are all under investigation for corporate fraud, market manipulation, and possible money laundering. I suggest you cooperate fully." As the agents began to read the rights to those present, Jack approached the window. The city stretched out before him, bright in the morning light. For the first time in weeks, he felt he could breathe freely. Lucy approached him, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, what will happen now?" Jack smiled softly at her. "Now, Lucy, we start over with truth as our foundation." The days that followed the dramatic meeting at Thompson Enterprises were a whirlwind of activity. News of the conspiracy and the subsequent arrests dominated the headlines. Shaking the financial world to its foundations, Jack, for his part, found himself in the eye of the hurricane. He spent hours each day cooperating with the authorities, providing statements and helping to unravel the complex web of deception that had enveloped his company. But in the midst of the chaos, Jack discovered a new sense of purpose. He was no longer motivated by ambition or the desire for power, but by a genuine desire to correct the mistakes of the past and use his influence for good. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in his study at home, he received an unexpected visit. Elizabeth entered, her face pale and haggard, far from the image of perfection she had always maintained. "Jack," she said softly, "we need to talk." He nodded, indicating for her to take a seat. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of years of lies and deceptions between them. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth finally said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I don't know at what point I lost my way, at what point money and power became more important than us." Jack looked at her, feeling a mixture of sadness and compassion. "I'm sorry too, Elizabeth. I think we both lost our way." Elizabeth looked at him with tears in her eyes. "How could you forgive me? After everything I did?" Jack stood up and approached the window, observing the garden where they had once dreamed of building a life together. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but I realized that clinging to resentment was only destroying me. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what happened. It means choosing peace over resentment." He turned to look at her. "Elizabeth, I think it's time for both of us to start over, separately, but free from the chains of the past." She nodded slowly, a mixture of sadness and relief on her face. "You're right. We both deserve the chance to rediscover ourselves." As Elizabeth prepared to leave, Jack felt a chapter of his life closing. But instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of anticipation for what was to come. The following days brought new challenges and opportunities. Jack worked tirelessly to restructure Thompson Enterprises, focusing on ethical and sustainable practices. He implemented unprecedented transparency policies and established a fund to compensate those who had been harmed by the corrupt practices of the past. But perhaps the most significant change was on a personal level. Jack began to dedicate time to causes that truly mattered to him. He established a foundation to support young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged communities, offering not only financial resources, but also mentorship. One afternoon, as he walked through the same park where it had all begun, Jack found himself once again face to face with the mysterious homeless man. This time, however, he felt no fear or anxiety upon seeing him. "You've changed," observed the homeless man, a slight smile on his wrinkled face. Jack nodded. "Thanks to you. Your words, though they terrified me at the time, were the catalyst I needed." The homeless man looked at him intensely. "It wasn't I who changed you, Jack Thompson. It was you yourself. I only showed you a door. You chose to walk through it." "The 30 days, Jack began, but the homeless man interrupted him with a soft laugh. "Time is an illusion, Jack. The 30 days were never about your physical death, but about the end of one life and the beginning of another. The life you were living, full of greed and deception, had to die so that you could be reborn." Jack felt a deep sense of peace upon hearing these words. "Who are you really?" he asked, though he already suspected he wouldn't get a clear answer. The homeless man smiled mysteriously. "I'm just a reminder, Jack. A reminder that there's always time to change, to redeem oneself, to find a greater purpose." With those words, the homeless man walked away, losing himself in the crowd of the park. Jack watched him leave, feeling that a cycle had been completed. That night, back in his study, Jack reflected on the incredible journey of the past few weeks. He had lost an empire built on lies, but he had gained something much more valuable, a second chance to live with integrity and purpose. As he looked out the window at the city he once thought he owned, Jack Thompson smiled. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive and free. The sound of his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Lucy. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You have to see the news. The stock market, the company's shares, they're rising." Jack thanked her for the information, but realized he no longer felt the urgency or euphoria that would have once overwhelmed him at such news. His value was no longer determined by the price of stocks or the size of his bank account. "Thank you, Lucy," he responded calmly. "But what do you think if tomorrow, instead of a board meeting, we organize a volunteer day with all the staff? I think it's time for Thompson Enterprises to start measuring its success not just in profits, but in the positive impact we can have on our community." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by Lucy's enthusiastic response. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, sir. I'll get to work on it right away." After hanging up, Jack headed to his bedroom. For the first time in years, he didn't set an alarm. Tomorrow would be a new day, the beginning of a new chapter, and he was eager to see what it would bring. As he prepared for bed, Jack reflected on the homeless man's words. The 30 days of his sentence had passed, but instead of an ending, Jack felt he was on the threshold of a new beginning. The ruthless magnate had died, and the man he had always wanted to be had been reborn. With a peaceful smile on his face, Jack Thompson closed his eyes, ready to dream of the possibilities that tomorrow would bring. The following days marked the beginning of a new era for Thompson Enterprises and for Jack himself. The volunteer day he had proposed was a resounding success, with employees from all levels working side by side on various community projects. The press, which until recently had been full of scandalous headlines about corruption in the company, now published inspiring stories about its transformation. Jack found himself immersed in a whirlwind of activity. But this time it was different. It was no longer about accumulating more power or wealth, but about using the resources at his disposal to generate real positive change. One morning, as he was having breakfast on the terrace of his mansion, he received an unexpected visit. Nathan, his son, whom he had barely seen in recent years due to their disagreements, was standing at the door. "Dad," Nathan said, his voice a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Can we talk?" Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "Of course, son. Please sit down." Over the next few hours, father and son had the most honest and profound conversation they had had in years. Nathan spoke of his frustration at seeing his father obsessed with power and money, of how he had wanted to follow a different path, but feared disappointing him. "I was wrong, Nathan," Jack admitted, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I spent so much time chasing the wrong things that I almost lost the most valuable thing I have. You." Nathan smiled, reaching out to take his father's hand. "It's never too late to change, Dad, and I'm proud of what you're doing now." That encounter was a turning point for Jack. He began to involve Nathan in the company's new projects, valuing his fresh perspective and passion for social change. Meanwhile, the transformation of Thompson Enterprises continued at an accelerated pace. Jack implemented unprecedented transparency policies, opened direct communication channels with employees at all levels, and established business ethics training programs. But the most significant change was the creation of the Thompson Foundation for Sustainable Development. This new entity, jointly directed by Jack and Nathan, would be dedicated to supporting social and environmental impact projects throughout the country. One afternoon, as Jack and Nathan were discussing the details of a new foundation project, Lucy entered the office with an expression of amazement. "Mr. Thompson, you have to see this," she said, turning on the office television on the screen. A renowned financial analyst was speaking enthusiastically. "What we're seeing at Thompson Enterprises is nothing short of revolutionary. They've shown that a company can be ethical, transparent, and socially responsible without sacrificing profitability. In fact, the company's shares have reached new historic highs. Jack and Nathan looked at each other, a mixture of surprise and satisfaction on their faces. "It seems the market is rewarding our new direction," Nathan commented. Jack nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "It's gratifying, no doubt. But you know what? I'm no longer obsessed with the stock price. What really excites me is the impact we can have." That night, as Jack walked through the park where it had all begun, he reflected on the incredible journey of the past few months. He had lost an empire built on lies, but he had gained something much more valuable: a renewed relationship with his son, a true purpose, and the opportunity to leave a positive legacy. As he sat on the same bench where he had met the mysterious homeless man, Jack felt a deep sense of peace. The 30 days that had been prophesied to him had not been the end, but the beginning of a new life. As the weeks passed, the new direction of Thompson Enterprises began to have a tangible impact, not only on the company and its employees, but on the entire community. The Thompson Foundation's projects were transforming neighborhoods, creating job opportunities, and improving the quality of life for thousands of people. However, not everything was rosy. One morning, as Jack was reviewing some reports in his office, Lucy entered with a worried expression. "Mr. Thompson, there's someone who wants to see you. He says it's urgent." Before Jack could respond, Robert Beggar, his former partner and one of the main conspirators in the takeover attempt, burst into the office. He looked haggard, very different from the neat and confident executive he used to be. "Jack," Robert said, his voice trembling, "I need your help." Jack slowly stood up, studying the man before him. "Robert, I didn't expect to see you here. Shouldn't you be preparing for your trial?" Robert collapsed into a chair, running a hand over his face. "The trial is the least of it, Jack. They're after my family. Some of our past associates, they think I've betrayed them, that I'm cooperating with the authorities." Jack felt a mix of emotions: compassion for the desperate man before him, but also caution. "And is it true? Are you cooperating?" Robert nodded slowly. "Yes. After seeing how you handled everything, after seeing the transformation of the company, I realized how wrong we were. I want to do the right thing, Jack, but now I fear for my life and that of my family." Jack remained silent for a moment, considering his options. Part of him wanted to reject Robert, remembering the betrayal and harm he had caused, but another part, the part that had learned the value of forgiveness and redemption, knew he couldn't turn his back. "All right, Robert," Jack finally said, "I'll help you, but I need you to be completely honest with me. I need to know everything." Over the next few hours, Robert revealed a network of corruption and organized crime that went far beyond what Jack had imagined. Names of influential politicians, judges, and other business tycoons came to light, painting a dark picture of the country's elite. As he listened, Jack realized that his work was far from over. The transformation of Thompson Enterprises was just the beginning. There was an entire system that needed to be changed. "Robert," Jack said, once his former partner had finished his account, "I'm going to help you protect your family, but in return I need you to keep doing the right thing. Together we can expose all of this and work for real change." Robert looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and fear in his eyes. "Why are you helping me, Jack? After everything I did?" Jack smiled softly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. I had mine, and now you have yours." That night, after making the necessary arrangements for Robert and his family's protection, Jack found himself once again in the park, seeking the wisdom of the mysterious homeless man. But this time the bench was empty. As he sat down, feeling the weight of the new revelations and the challenges to come, Jack heard a familiar voice behind him. "True change," said the homeless man, appearing as if out of nowhere, "begins when we are willing to face not only our own demons, but those of society as a whole." Jack turned, a smile of recognition on his face. "I knew I'd find you here. I need your advice one more time." The homeless man sat down beside him, his eyes shining with ancient wisdom. "You've come a long way, Jack Thompson, but your journey is far from over. The question is, are you ready for the next chapter?" Jack looked towards the city, his determination growing. "I'm ready," he said firmly. It's time to take this change beyond my company. It's time to change the system." The homeless man nodded, an enigmatic smile on his face. "Then, my friend, prepare yourself, because the real battle is just beginning." As the sun set over the city, Jack Thompson realized that the 30 days that had been prophesied to him were not an ending but the beginning of a much greater mission. A mission that could change not only his life, but that of an entire nation. With a new determination in his heart, Jack stood up ready to face the challenges that would come. The road would be difficult, but now he had something he lacked before: a true purpose and the strength that comes from doing what is right. The days following Robert Vega's revelation were a whirlwind of activity for Jack. Working closely with Daniel Guzman, the Attorney General, they began to unravel the complex web of corruption that Robert had exposed. However, Jack soon realized that they were dealing with something much bigger and more dangerous than they had anticipated. Powerful politicians, corrupt judges, and unscrupulous business magnates formed an almost impenetrable network of influence and power. One afternoon, as Jack and Nathan were reviewing some documents in the office, Lucy rushed in, her face pale with concern. "Mr. Thompson, you have to see this," she said. Turning on the television on the screen, a well-known news anchor was speaking gravely. "Anonymous sources have leaked information suggesting that the recent transformation of Thompson Enterprises could be an elaborate cover-up for illegal activities. It is alleged that Jack Thompson is using his new philanthropic image to hide years of fraud and tax evasion." Jack and Nathan looked at each other, stunned. "This is their work," Jack said, his voice tense. "They're striking back." Nathan nodded, his face determined. "We can't let them intimidate us, Dad. We've come too far to give up now." The following days were a frenzy of press conferences, interviews, and meetings with lawyers. Jack found himself fighting not only for his reputation, but for the future of everything he had built in the past few months. In the midst of the crisis, Jack received an unexpected call from Elizabeth. "Jack," she said, her voice trembling, "I just saw the news. I want you to know that I had nothing to do with this, and I want to help. I know things that could be useful." Jack felt a mix of emotions: surprise, caution, but also a glimmer of hope. "I'm listening, Elizabeth." Over the next hour, Elizabeth revealed a series of connections and secret deals that shed light on who was really behind the attacks against Jack. Her testimony could be crucial in unmasking the true culprits. "Thank you, Elizabeth," Jack said when she finished. "This means a lot." There was a moment of silence on the line before Elizabeth responded. "It's the least I can do, Jack. Maybe this way I can start making amends for my mistakes." That night, Jack called an emergency meeting with his closest team: Nathan, Daniel Guzman, Robert Vega, and, to everyone's surprise, Elizabeth. "What we're facing," Jack began, looking at each of those present, "is bigger than any of us. This isn't just about saving Thompson Enterprises or clearing my name. It's about unmasking a corrupt system that has been operating in the shadows for decades." Daniel nodded gravely. "With the information we have now, we can start building a solid case. But it won't be easy. These people are powerful and won't give up without a fight." "And they'll fight dirty," Robert added, his face grim. "They've already shown they're willing to do anything to protect themselves." Elizabeth, who had remained silent until then, spoke up. "I know their tactics, their weaknesses. I can help anticipate their moves." Jack looked at his ex-wife, seeing in her not the woman who had betrayed him, but an unexpected ally in this crucial battle. "Thank you, Elizabeth. We'll need all the help we can get." Nathan, who had been listening attentively, leaned forward. "I have an idea. What if we use the Thompson Foundation as a platform to expose the truth? We can organize a series of public forums, invite experts, investigative journalists, get people talking." Jack smiled, proud of his son's initiative. "It's risky, but it could work. If we can get the public involved, it will be harder for them to silence us." As the group continued discussing strategies and action plans, Jack couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. They were about to embark on the most important battle of their lives, a battle that could change the course of the nation. Outside, night had fallen over the city. Jack approached the window, observing the flickering lights of the buildings somewhere out there. Their enemies were planning their next move, but here, in this room, an unlikely group of allies was preparing to face them. "Let the battle begin," Jack murmured to himself, his determination stronger than ever. The following weeks were a frenzy of activity. The Thompson Foundation, under the joint direction of Jack and Nathan, launched a series of public forums titled Transparency: The Path Forward. These events, broadcast live on the internet and television, quickly became a national phenomenon. Business ethics experts, investigative journalists, and former officials willing to speak out shared the stage, gradually exposing the depth of corruption that had plagued the country for decades. Each revelation was like a piece of a giant puzzle, and little by little, the public began to see the complete picture. However, Jack's enemies did not stand idly by. Attempts at sabotage, veiled threats, and a smear campaign in media outlets allied with power constantly threatened to derail their efforts. It was during the fifth forum, when the incident occurred, that would change everything. Jack was in the middle of his opening speech when a man in the audience stood up abruptly. "You're a hypocrite, Thompson," the man shouted. "You pretend to be a saint, but your hands are as dirty as the rest." Before anyone could react, the man pulled out a gun. Chaos erupted in the room. Jack, acting on instinct, lunged to protect a young journalist who was sitting in the front row. A shot was heard. When the smoke cleared and security finally subdued the attacker, Jack lay on the ground, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. The next few hours were a blur of sirens, hospital lights, and worried faces. Nathan, Elizabeth, Robert, and Daniel took turns in the waiting room, united in their concern for the man who, in one way or another, had changed their lives. It was near dawn when the surgeon came out to give news. "Mr. Thompson is stable," he announced to everyone's relief. "The bullet grazed his heart, but we managed to extract it. He'll need time to recover, but we expect a full recovery." While Jack fought for his life in the hospital, something extraordinary began to happen outside. News of the attempt on his life spread rapidly, and with it, a wave of public outrage. Thousands of people took to the streets, not only in the capital but throughout the country, demanding justice and an end to corruption. The Thompson Foundation forums, which until then had been viewed by many as an interesting but somewhat abstract curiosity, suddenly became the center of national attention. People began to connect the dots, to see how the corruption that Jack and his team had been exposing affected their daily lives. Nathan, finding a strength he didn't know he had, took the reins of both the company and the foundation in his father's absence. With the support of Elizabeth, Robert, and Daniel, he continued the mission that Jack had initiated. It was during the 8th forum, 2 weeks after the attempt, when Nathan made the announcement that would shake the foundations of power. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm despite the emotion, "today we have irrefutable evidence of a conspiracy at the highest level to keep our country mired in corruption. Names, dates, bank transactions, everything will be handed over to the competent authorities and made public." The impact was immediate and seismic. In the days that followed, resignations of high-ranking officials, arrests of prominent businessmen, and the opening of multiple investigations dominated the headlines. Meanwhile, in his hospital room, Jack began to regain consciousness. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was Nathan's smiling face. "Dad," Nathan said, tears of joy in his eyes, "we did it. The truth is coming to light." Jack, still weak, but with a spark of his old vigor in his eyes, took his son's hand. "Tell me everything," he whispered. As Nathan recounted the events of the past few weeks, Jack felt a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. The sacrifice had been worth it. The change he had dreamed of was beginning to become a reality. But even as he celebrated these victories, Jack knew the work was far from over. The battle against corruption and injustice would be long and difficult. But now, more than ever, he was prepared to face it. With Nathan by his side and a team of loyal allies backing him, Jack Thompson realized that the 30 days that had been prophesied to him did not mark the end of his life, but the beginning of his true legacy, a legacy of integrity, justice, and positive change that would endure long beyond his time in this world. As the sun set over the city, bathing the hospital room in a warm golden glow, Jack closed his eyes, at peace with the knowledge that, whatever happens, he had chosen the right path. The path of truth and redemption. The months following Jack's recovery witnessed seismic changes in society. The exposure of the corruption network had triggered a series of unprecedented reforms in government, the business sector, and the judicial system. The nation seemed to be awakening from a long slumber, with citizens demanding transparency and accountability at all levels. Jack, although still recovering, became an emblematic figure of this renewal movement. His story of redemption and his fight against corruption inspired many, from young activists to veteran businessmen seeking to redeem their own questionable practices. One sunny morning, 6 months after the attempt on his life, Jack found himself on the terrace of his mansion, contemplating the city he once thought he owned. Beside him was Nathan, who in recent months had proven to be not only a loyal son, but also a capable and visionary leader. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" Nathan asked, noticing his father's distant gaze. Jack smiled, turning to his son. "About how much everything has changed and about how much there's still left to do." At that moment, Lucy appeared on the terrace. "Mr. Thompson, you have visitors." To Jack's surprise, Elizabeth entered, followed by Robert Vega and Daniel Guzman. The three wore expressions of determination mixed with expectation. "Jack," Elizabeth began, "we've been talking. We believe it's time to take the next step." Robert nodded, continuing, "The Thompson Foundation has done an incredible job exposing corruption, but now we need to build on that foundation." "What do you have in mind?" Jack asked, intrigued. Daniel stepped forward. "A political movement, one that brings the principles of transparency, ethics, and social justice that we've been promoting directly into government." Jack looked at them, surprised. "A political movement? I'm not a politician." "It's not about you being a politician, Dad," Nathan interrupted, his voice full of enthusiasm. "It's about creating a platform for the voices we've been amplifying to be heard in the corridors of power." Jack remained silent for a moment, considering the proposal a year ago. The idea of getting involved in politics would have seemed absurd to him. But now, "You're right," he finally said. "We can't stop now. The change we've initiated needs to take root in institutions to endure." The following months were a whirlwind of activity. The announcement of the creation of the Movement for National Renewal, led by Jack Thompson, shook the political landscape. Many saw it as a threat to the status quo, but for a population tired of corruption and cynicism, it represented hope for real change. Jack, however, was clear that he would not be the political face of the movement. Instead, he worked tirelessly behind the scenes, mentoring a new generation of leaders, including Nathan, who emerged as one of the most prominent voices of the movement. It was on the eve of the elections, a year after that fateful encounter in the park, when Jack decided to take a night walk without bodyguards or assistants. He walked until he reached the bench where it had all begun. To his surprise, the mysterious homeless man was there, as if he had been waiting for him. "You've come a long way, Jack Thompson," said the homeless man, an enigmatic smile on his wrinkled face. Jack sat down beside him, feeling a strange mixture of déjà vu and closure. "Thanks to you," he replied. "Your words changed my life." The homeless man shook his head. "I only showed the door. You chose to walk through it and face what was on the other side." They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the city stretching out before them, the 30 days. Jack began, "They were never about your physical death," the homeless man interrupted. "They were about the death of your old self and the birth of something new, something bigger than yourself." Jack nodded, finally understanding. "Who are you really?" he asked, though he suspected he wouldn't get a direct answer. The homeless man smiled mysteriously. "I am many things and none a reminder, perhaps, that there is always time for change, for redemption, for doing what is right." With those words, the homeless man stood up. "Your journey is not over, Jack Thompson. In fact, it's just beginning. But now you have the tools and the wisdom to face whatever comes. Before Jack could respond, the homeless man walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. Jack sat for a moment longer, reflecting on the incredible journey he had embarked upon. He had lost an empire built on lies, but he had gained something much more valuable: a purpose, a reunited family, and the opportunity to leave a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. The next day, as the election results began to come in, showing overwhelming support for the movement for national renewal, Jack watched from the campaign headquarters. Surrounded by his family and friends, Nathan approached. Him, a look of awe on his face. "We did it, Dad, we really did it." Jack hugged his son, feeling a deep sense of pride and hope. "No, son," he gently corrected. "We're just beginning." As the room erupted in celebrations, Jack looked out the window at the city he once thought he owned. Now he understood that his true legacy wasn't in the buildings or bank accounts, but in the lives he had touched and the change he had inspired. The 30 days that had been prophesied to him had turned into a year of transformation, not just for him but for an entire nation. And as the sun set on this new era of hope and renewal, Jack Thompson smiled, at peace with the knowledge that, whatever happens, he had chosen the right path, the path of truth, redemption, and positive change.